Is this Stephen Shellenberger or Stephen Shellen? Who am I speaking with?
Yeah, it's a combination really of both.
Who do you feel like?
I feel like Shellen is the flour and Schellenberger is the baking powder.
So we should have a decent bread or cake in the oven.
Yeah,
Why don't we put a why don't why don't we put a loaf in the oven? You and me today.
yeah.
I wanted to do this conversation with you. I saw you yesterday, and we were doing some interesting investigations on promoting our work. Uh, right?
Yeah.
That's what we were doing. Let me fix my hat so I don't look so stupid when I look at myself. I was wearing my hat in the German way, and I don't want to make too many allusions to the Germans because I've mentioned this to you that the German art is probably the ugliest art ever produced in the history of art. Uh,
Well, it's severe, right? It's always severe.
you're being nice now, right?
No, I'm well. I don't know. Maybe you disagree, but I've always found that well, certainly 20th century art, German art, it's just and prior to that as well, but especially the 20th century German art is just very severe. I
In the
mean, I
sense that
that
in the sense that it's difficult to look at times.
yeah, I mean, it's not, which I actually do. I like the fact that it's not considered necessary. It's certainly not considered decorative art. I just think of 20th century art and 21st century German art as a lot of black, big brush strokes, bold, almost vulgar. That to me is how I surmise, German art in my mind, anyway.
It might be considered to be more on the painful side than the pleasurable side.
Yeah, and you wonder if that's not post World War II art as well, because anyone growing up, I mean, then you can draw the comparisons to Canada, US, Australia, Britain, any of these countries. It's very easy to fault the Germans in the Second World War because they followed Hitler. But now we're finding out more and more, and then some of us have known, all along pretty much about people like the Clintons, the Bushes. I throw the Trudeaus in that bag. How
The new
how
dynasty in Canada.
yeah, they're the Canadian dynasty, and this Justin Trudeau, who's a school teacher, is now leading the nation of Canada, which really is just an arm of the Queen and the royal family. And 97%, I think, of the land in Canada is considered crown land, which belongs to a bunch of bankers and the Queen in the city of
And
London.
we pay royalty taxes to the Queen. It's called realty, but it's really, I imagine realty and royalty must be kind of connected in some way.
Yeah, so I guess the point I'm trying to make is Germans growing up post World War II, they had a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, that they didn't rebel against Hitler, that they went along with it, and or their parents or their grandparents had gone along with it. So there was all this shame and guilt. In your case, you didn't really go through that, and that's good. But I think a lot of Germans have gone through that. And when I look at countries like U.S., Canada, any of these, countries, I'm thinking, really, look what we put up with. Look what's being done now. Look what's being exposed in terms of, a few oligarchs that control everything, encourage, make wars happen, make money on war. I mean, it's just endless. So, and the destruction of the world. So, we don't have anything to be proud of. I mean, if we want to compare ourselves with post World War II Germans, we've been sucked in just as badly. I mean,
So the German art might be considered realist art in that sense.
maybe because maybe they're more aware of their hypocrisy and what they allowed themselves to go along with. I mean, in terms of this kind of crazy little mustachioed charismatic leader called Hitler. But you
You
look at
have, okay, well, you know, when you reference Hitler, you have to think in terms of the art. George Gross and Otto Dix, Beckman, the expressionist artists of that period in the 20s, that also obviously the Dada movement was initiated in the 19 just prior, no, actually just after the First World War. So yeah, there's all that influence to carry on a tradition that came out of a painter that I really appreciate is Grunwald, the guy that did the brutal crucifixion. You know that crucifixion at Isenheim. It's an altarpiece where he depicts Jesus in the most grotesque, brutal, maimed, murdered kind of individual on the cross. And when I grew up, they had a replica of that image in my Catholic church. I went to a few times a week. I'd have to go in the morning sometimes, and then of course on Sundays, and I'd see this image of a guy on a piece of wood, and it was totally terrifying. So
oh, that's almost it's almost Renaissance-ish, isn't it?
yeah, he's the German Renaissance, I suppose, if you want. He's, I think, the dates on him is like 1460 or something like that. I think I'm not sure exactly, but he would be at the cusp of that rising awareness of some kind that might be considered a Renaissance. But the Germans, you know, with I suppose you have Durer and people that glorified the beauty, whereas this guy really was very unapologetic about the situation we're in.
Okay.
You
Which
know,
is entire. Which I gotta say, if anyone's going to be watching this, I have to say the point you just made. There's a very fine line between painting the harsh reality of what people are growing up in, and as dark and foreboding and disgusting as that may be, and then the other flip side of that, which looks similar, but that's this kind of I call it Luciferian, a Satanist inspired art, do as thou wilt, where you've got the blood, the guts, the real blood, the semen,
Abramovich.
but you know what? People have done it worse than her. I mean, I've been to art shows in LA where I'm like, it's this mutilated body painted with real blood, and just, this is like 20 years ago, and I'm seeing art like that hanging in good galleries in Los Angeles, and yeah, it's like, you know, there's one thing to make an investment in art. It's quite something else if you want to take one of those paintings and imagine putting that on your wall. I mean, you'd have to be out of your mind, like.
You're probably addressing something here in terms of what I would consider to be intent, and that you have paintings that express an outrage, and the other version, the Abramoviches, express complicity or compliance.
Right.
And it's difficult to
Children
distinguish for some
mutilated.
people, right?
Yeah, see, that's a fine line, and that's, I guess, the distinction I was trying to make is that it's one thing to paint the grotesque, sad, angry, brutal life that somebody's forced to live, or someone's living in, or someone's experienced. That's one thing because you paint what you know. So it's one thing to paint that, but it's quite something else when you're actually doing these effigies, or you're glorifying this dark, disgusting, mutilation of human kind of art. I mean, that's
So,
quite different.
so this, I don't know why I started the conversation about the ugly, but this is obviously quite appropriate in the way that, you know, if I'm talking to you about what is really meaningful in art today, and we can be easily deceived by people who have appropriated the sense of ugly that comes out of the tradition of outrage, and a contrary view, in a sense, to being appearing to be contrarian and avant-garde, like the Abramovich or Damien Hirst or Julian Schnabels or the expressionist types like that, but are really quite compliant with a system that has seduced us into something that is really quite a sad and narrow dead end, probably.
Yeah,
Right? Would
yeah,
you would that sort of synopsize your feeling about this? Are we kind of like, you know, birds of a feather here?
yeah. I think so. You know what? I just went while you're saying.
I'm gonna try and piss you off in some way so that we have an argument. Maybe should we have an argument about this? Maybe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You
We
know,
should.
I mean, it's
Okay, I'll give you an argument.
yeah.
You know what Wiener I loved? I'd lived in London, England when I was still pretty young in my, I guess I was 20, 21, 22. I lived in London, England, and I didn't really have much of an appreciation for art yet. But I knew someone that lived in this small little mews in South Kensington. These are these little tiny streets where the carriage houses used to be, right?
Yeah.
Because if you had money, you had a big house, then you had a
A
carriage.
coach house.
A coach house, yeah, and the horses and everything were kept there, and the guy who took care of the horses lived above the horse
Nice.
stable carriage, right? And it's called the mews, and that's where people would take their horses and their, and go into their, Anyway, so there was this little fancy mews though. It was all really very picturesque and nice, and I knew a guy um, that, anyway, we'd go over there and drink his booze, and he had cocaine, and we'd go to nightclubs after, and we were just young, crazy kids, really. But right next door to him, and that guy's name was Lionel Bart, and Lionel Bart wrote Oliver. If you've ever heard of the musical
Of course,
Oliver,
yes.
yeah. So that was Lionel Bart, and he had all these stories about Cockneys, and he spoke in rhymey-timey Cockney, with a Cockney accent. But next door to him lived Francis Bacon, the artist. And I'd see this guy, and occasionally, if I was over at Lionel's with my friend, and we'd see this guy creeping along, and he looked like he was drunk most of the time and stuff, right? And a very odd-looking guy. Well, I saw his work, and then I later didn't see his work at his house, but I saw it in galleries in London, and then later in New York and Los Angeles, I saw his work. And I remember one painting he had up at a restaurant called Morton's in Los Angeles. And I mean, I loved his work. When you really look at his work and the people hanging on meat hooks and things like this, I mean, and because of Lionel,
Well, that's what the work looked like. It was quite severe, as you say.
yeah, well, if you look it up, it's Francis Bacon, artist. It's very severe. It's very brutal. He was gay. He used to go down and pick up sailors, and then they'd beat the living crap out of them. Right? This was his idea of fun.
Okay, Bacon had a similar history.
Punished for his homosexuality.
Right.
So he would go out and pick up sailors or commando sailors in a sailor bar and get the absolute crap beat out of them, and then manage to crawl home and make paintings. Like it was but Tom, it was a miserable life. Like that's a miserable life.
I want to sign up. I want to sign up. I want to be an artist too. Yeah.
But when you look at the work, you can see that kind of self-loathing, pain, and yeah, a little bit of a celebration of like this darkness, for lack of a better word.
Oh, so it'd be kind of like the opposite of Trish Romance.
Yeah, he was not doing it to be avant-garde, trendy, or cool. I think that guy was literally painting those kind of paintings because he wasn't. I mean, if he didn't have a paintbrush the morning after one of his, dark little forays into these dark alleys and getting the crap beat out of him, if he didn't have a paintbrush the next day, I think he would have just given up and killed himself. But he poured all that kind of pain, anguish, self hate into his art. Now, whether he was screwing little boys or cutting them up in his basement, I mean, I can't say. Lionel never told me about that, but Lionel certainly filled me in on other things that he was up to.
So,
But that darkness came out of, I guess, a real place in a way, So then you have to kind of, this is what you and I have to do. Then we have to question, well, that art, which in its darkness can be very beautiful in a way. Now, is that okay? Because that guy was obviously a tortured soul. So is it okay that he made those paintings? Whereas on the flip side, you've got people that are, people living in suburbia kind of thing, or, Johnny Depp with his tattoos and his now millions and millions of dollars, and they're celebrating, like the Memphis Three who killed those little boys, and they're celebrating all this darkness and all this, mutilation. It's quite a different
it's sort
thing
of like using people like that as a vicarious sort of carrier almost of their own lacks. It's kind of like people have a romance with this dark side, and he expressed this dark side in a way that people who collect work that represent this depravity are kind of like saying to themselves, we have very miserable lives, but we collect somebody that we think is brilliant because they're self-mutilating, which is what we really like to do, but we're too chicken shit. Yeah, does that
maybe.
something like that? That okay, well, you've hit on something here that that's how I'd interpret it. That if you can get away with doing this sort of self-mutilation, even Francis Bacon, to the extent that he really mutilated his subjects. If you look at his paintings, they're all about distortions, and
Right.
there was recently a big kerfuffle by a contemporary artist, Dana Schutz. She painted an image, what she called open casket, at the Biennale, the what is that? The Whitney Biennale, or whatever or the Whitney. Do they do it every year? The Whitney, that American show.
I don't
I
know.
think it's a Biennale maybe of American art. Anyway, this Dana Schutz, who is a woman artist, very well known, she painted the what she called open casket of this black teenager that was murdered in the 50s. I think his name was Till or Tillman. And the black community, Black Lives Matter, did a huge protest that this painting was included by a white woman who was painting this distorted, mutilated face of the casket that he was in. They actually had the casket open for people to see how the cops had murdered this guy. And it's a major, I'm not sure if you've heard of this. I think he was called Till or Tillman in the 50s. And it created such an outrage that the Whitney was asked to take the painting down. And I think it was more in connection. People are they're not outraged much anymore by any visuals. I mean, all you have to watch is news reports of, uh, uh, you know, Fallujah or the killing zones on the planet now, and you don't need to see horror movies anymore. You could, but people are desensitized. But what was interesting to me was that there was an outrage because the black community was outraged that this white woman would appropriate a tragedy in one of her paintings.
Ah, jeez,
Yes,
man.
exactly.
You
Ah,
know what
Jesus,
I,
right.
you know what I say? I say, fuck
Yeah.
that.
So
This is just stupid. I mean, I can tell black people when they get it wrong to go fuck themselves, and I can tell Asians, Chinese, white, whatever you are, like go fuck
and
yourself. That's just like bullshit. That's Black Lives Matter, Soros sponsored,
exactly.
politically correct bullshit. Tell them to go fuck
So we're all
themselves.
herded.
That I'm quite sure was doing that painting because that's a painting that I'd want to make.
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
one of the quintessential murders out of that whole pre Kennedy era, where you still had guys on horses in white pointed hoodies,
Yeah, the
right,
village
driving around,
idiots. The hats of the village
the
idiots.
village idiot riding around killing black
Yeah.
people. And this woman, I think, made that painting because of the outrage of it. and then she gets shit
Hammered.
on this Black Lives Matter politically correct
That's right.
sideshow.
How are you? You do not deserve to show images of the community as a white person. You're not allowed to show images of a community that has been so mutilated and abused. So instead, yeah. I mean, I agree with you on this.
Okay. That's a good one, man. That's a great example, I think, of someone making art, I think, responsibly or for the right
There you
purpose or
go. Exact. It's the only
intent.
one I've seen so far in the last few decades.
You know, but you're a Satanist and you like to screw kids and you can do mutilation art and performance art and the Whitney and the MoMA and they're all going to give you these huge, endorsements and these huge
And sell for
sponsorships.
millions of dollars like Damien Hirst
Yeah,
butterfly
come
paintings.
on. And all you're doing is celebrating, like mutilating
Destruction and
people.
mutilation,
It's
yes.
not even a war. This didn't happen to your family. You're actually doing it. You're celebrating your neighbor doing it to little kids in the neighborhood. Oh, and that's going to be your art
Now,
show.
what is
Oh
it
my.
that's so hard for people to distinguish? I mean, what is the confusion? We haven't had a decent art movement since Warhol died. You could probably even argue that to the extent that the Warhol, that popism, should have maybe been 6 months, but it lasted 50 years. I mean, people are still producing art like from screens. You know, people are reproducing the Warhol art still. Can you imagine that?
Well, they're still trying. Listen, every young college or university student's trying to reproduce Jean-Michel Basquiat paintings. I mean, and it's still considered, ooh, that's so edgy in some small little town in Oklahoma where you basically copycat Jean-Michel Basquiat and ooh, oh, isn't that? Oh, that's different. It's like 40-year-old art. Like, come on. Like, this is ridiculous, you know? I think the worst thing you could do to really flip stuff on its end is like make really beautiful art. Wow, beautiful, colorful, like celebration art. And oh, wouldn't that be just shocking in this environment, where our environment is like, and I'm sorry, my friends have done, I have friends that do installation art, but I mean, sometimes if you go to a major museum and the room is a garbage pile, and then it's like 2 pages you have to read on why this is important, that's another one. Fuck that shit, like fuck, that's awful. Like that's no, fuck that. I don't want to read 2 pages, an explanation telling me why I am supposed to politically correct, fit this into some kind of, parameter inside my art mind where this is important art to see. No, it's not.
So we're kind of between a rock and a hard place. The way I always feel about this, because you have artists that might be considered to be of quite innovative. Remember yesterday we were sitting driving back, and I said to you that creativity really is quite uh, in the sense that it takes creativity to tie your shoelace, right? When you're 3 years old and you learn how to tie your shoelace, that's quite creative, I would say. So to say
Yeah,
artists are creative,
as a 3-year-old, it is really exciting. Or a
that's
2-year-old, right?
that's right,
No, it is, man. It's the greatest thing that ever
exactly.
happened to you when you're that
And
age.
so just
It's like I figured this
yeah,
out. I can do it myself.
so just
This is
imagine
amazing.
you reproduce this in contemporary art, that people are basically learning how to tie their shoelaces and think it's the cherry on top of the icing, right? It's like this sort of feeling, and that just because you're calling yourself creative, all of a sudden you're really important, and everybody wants to be an artist because you can exercise your creativity. Now, from my point of view, I think you can exercise your creativity as a plumber or as an accountant or as a bungee jumper. I don't care. You develop maybe some innovation in whatever field that you might be in, and you're creative. And I think they should give you the Governor General's Award. Why the fuck not? Go ahead. But
Okay, so what about artists? What about painting then? How are we
okay,
different?
well, this is the conversation. I think this is like this is where we get down to the nitty gritty now. We've covered the usual suspects, as I say. the people that have actually let us down that are being promoted in a culture, what I call, and I think you appreciate this. What is it?
The culture of death.
Exactly. And I think that this is quite an irony because it was John Paul II who coined this in, in one of his encyclicals where he described, he headed the culture of death, and he listed all the people that contribute to this culture of death, kind of like, the gays and the murderers and the frauds and the thieves and the bisexuals, and he listed everybody that was part of the culture of death. He forgot to list himself and his institution.
Exactly.
Right?
And most of his cardinals and bishops as well.
Exactly. He just sort of failed to. Since we all know this already, maybe he assumed that we knew this already, that they're all like degenerates, and he didn't have
Isn't
to.
that isn't that kind of how that's the operandi? What do you call it? Modus operandi, though, for these fuckers, that they'll draw attention to the bad things, but they'll always say it's others doing it when they're doing it themselves.
I think this is one of their tactics, isn't it? That they accuse you of what it is they're doing.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
this would apply in the art as well. That the reason they can ignore the work of value, and I want to get into this with you, the work that actually has value to a human being, that they can diminish or minimize someone's work because they have many different excuses. They never look at themselves. They're not, I don't know if objectivity is actually possible, but the reason we're having a difficult time promoting our work, as far as I'm concerned, is because we're actually touching on something that is not connected to this complicity and vulgarity. So even though...
Okay, I got to cut you off because this is something that I thought of earlier and it really bugs me. I don't think there's any artist on the planet right now who's been more prolific trying to draw attention to Fukushima than you, right?
I'm not sure, but I've done quite a bit of work on it. Yeah, I have hundreds of paintings.
What other artists? I don't know. Like, it seems like something Crisco, if he was still alive, the guy that did the huge installations, he wrapped cities.
He's still alive.
Cristo. Is Cristo still alive?
He's still kicking.
Okay, because he should have done something on
something, exactly.
He should have wrapped
a nuclear
Japan.
Plant.
Exactly. He should have wrapped Japan with caution, like one of those huge yellow, caution,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? All the way around Japan.
That would have been monumental. Now,
wouldn't that have been art that said something, though?
Wow. Would he have ever been loved in the future for that kind of work?
That's right. That could have been his foot.
That would have been it. That would have been, yes.
Would have been it.
He would have been the shit. I'm telling you, if he'd done that. But of course, if he had done that, they would have totally cut him off at the knees.
Yeah, but he's old anyway.
Yeah, he doesn't need his knees anymore.
He wraps Paris in pink. He does the whole highway in yellow umbrellas in Los Angeles. What is any of that saying? Yes. What does any of that mean?
Subtlety. Subtlety. It's like,
Oh, it's pretty to look
having
at.
Having your dick tickled with a feather. Having your dick tickled with a feather.
Man, he missed his boat, huh? Wrapping Japan with that yellow, gaudy caution tape. Like with a murder victim, the cops, put that tape out, right?
Yeah, with crime scene written on it.
Yeah. But see, that's art saying something. My point is, with the Fukushima, I don't know anyone that's addressed it more than you have in your work, and it's like that never gets to show in a museum today. That'll never ever see the inside of a museum.
Now you're
one of your astronauts could, but I don't think that. And it's funny because Basquiat got away with writing all kinds of stuff in his paintings, and he was exposing things from a sort of Queens, New York, half Haitian black mentality. I mean, that was where his, things came from that inspired him. But yeah, your work, maybe an astronaut, but the Fukushima work, I mean, it's almost like the museums today. You'd think that that would be a part that should be a part of art that's about Fukushima, art that's about child abuse, art that's about what's going on. But no, it's not. It's not. It's just silly, goofy, really unimportant work that doesn't really say anything.
I sort of feel like if I want to elevate our conversation into a historical context, I almost feel like you're the Ezra Pound to my T.S. Eliot, uh, kind of making notes on the wasteland. I don't know if you're aware, but the wasteland is a brutal poem that is almost unintelligible to an ordinary human being, right? So you create a magnificent artwork, and Ezra Pound was probably the most intellectual person to have lived in the 20th century, and T.S. Eliot wasn't far behind. But he had to dissect that poem, and I'm not sure if it mattered to people per se, but if I'm going to elevate our conversation to a level of historical significance, and people, let you and I talk, and our art looks actually quite, um, I would say, accessible. Like, from the point of view that, that argument about a person comes into my studio and says, hey, my kid could do that, right? I don't know if you've heard that. People have
Of
heard
course, yeah.
that. And, when you talk about my work, I know that you have unconditional love for what I do. So I'm not sure how seriously I could take you on that because, the way I love your work, there is like, and I'm not sure if I've been able to sort of separate myself the same way as, I'm not sure if Ezra Pound was the right comparison. But anyway, what you're saying.
He sounds like he's too smart for me, kind of.
Yeah, when you say, Ackerman's work is significant and meaningful because he's hit the nail on the head, why the fuck didn't Ezra Pound just say, this fucking poem is the shit, Instead, he put like 10 volumes of notes all over it. And anyway, I appreciate your understanding of what I'm doing, but that's because you're doing it yourself. Because somewhere in your own nature, you've discovered an originality which is tied. Uh, I think here's the conversation that I want to have with you about this. That when we're talking about creativity in art, it's kind of like consciousness. It's everything, right? The entire cosmos is creative when you look at it, right? Everything. And consciousness is everything the way creativity appears to be everything. So to say artists are creative is almost an insult to me from the point of view that my position is not to be just creative, but to be original within the context of what really matters. What really matters. So if we look at art history, we look at artists that have been brilliant, innovative, from wherever far back from Giotto, Masaccio, you want to go to Velasquez, and my favorite has always been Michelangelo and Goya,
Me
who,
too.
who produced
Yeah.
work that was so original in its the when you looked at it, you would be at the time, not anymore maybe, but at the time, you were like freaked out almost by the way he represented the. Remember the royal family, that painting he did? They looked like pig farmers. You right?
Yeah.
That so
Yeah. How do you get away with
well,
that?
I don't know. He must have, maybe he was humping the queen. I don't know, but he
How did artists get away with those things then, though?
yeah, like they were able under the radar to do their subversion and get seduce people into their vision, right? Why can't we?
They might even get locked up for a couple of months or something, or they'd get in some trouble. But nowadays, you don't, you just are, you're not going to do jail time. The jail time is that you're just going to be
Ignored.
completely shut
Ignored.
out, ignored and
Yes.
shut out. That's the modern era of what in the old days, if you were making art that was in any way
Right.
revolutionary or exposing the royal family, or then you might get you get a slap on the wrist. You don't get any, Michelangelo that won't, is not going to get any marble that year. You know what I mean? Like the church is mad at him, even though he's such a humble, like Christian guy. We're still going to punish Michelangelo. He was way too honest, you know.
So we're
And
kind of
but that was then. They didn't lose. They weren't. Yeah, they weren't ignored. Our modern day prisons, it's not about going to jail. That might get some attention. No, it's that we're
yes,
ignored.
we're
We don't even get through the revolving door. Is locked. We don't even get halfway through the
but
revolving
even
door.
worse than that, some, and you're at the tail end of this, or at the middle of this, of being completely defunded, that you are completely ostracized in the sense that making a living anymore. It's a kind of punishment, right? That
Oh, it's hell on earth,
it's
man.
it's like even worse
It's
than
hell on earth.
it's
That I mean,
yeah.
yeah, it's just hell on
So
earth.
so
It's
it's
you know, I got punished because I wanted to know who threatened my 4 year
right.
old son 21 years ago. And I've had ridicule, hate, lies. And anytime I did do something nutty or offbeat, which was often when I was young, but every indiscretion, everything is blowing up. Like, and you know, all I wanted to know was who threatened my 4 year old
And
son.
on
And
top of
I,
that, you're actually making work that represents your experience,
that,
which has to do with a
that's
topic
right.
that's probably, I would actually assign in terms of value and whether it's important or not, but I would say that the abuse of children actually supersedes what we're facing with something like this nuclear destruction, because it's what I've called the a priori. It precedes all the destruction that comes post this abuse. It's like you abuse children, they'll abuse us. And who's running these operations, these corporations? They're all abused children. I mean, you look at the history of English, the schools, the prep schools, and all that. How children are abused in that system, and they're the ones that are running the show, the bankers, and right. So
Absolutely.
what?
The kids educated at Eton and then later Cambridge, Oxford, but especially a school like a prep school like Eton. I mean, yeah, it's just it's generational
We're going
abuse,
back
and
a
I
long
mean, and
time
you
here,
don't think
Stephen. We're
going to cost
right.
parents in
We're
different
going back a
schools.
long time here. We're going back thousands of years of a tradition of abusing the child to the extent that they become chattel or some sort of value to you as a pleasure object or something, you know, a slave. I mean, this tradition of the weak one being abused, whether they're elderly or children or women, this is part of this culture of death that's been there for such a long time. And who are the
Good
goddamn
point.
artists? Who are the goddamn artists making a statement in a brilliant way with originality? Where are they? Where the fuck are they, right?
They're not allowed to get any attention.
So you're making the work based on your understanding of how deep this is through your own experience, obviously, but you don't have to have gone through it personally to have an appreciation for it. I also
That's
for
right.
it.
It's like the white woman doing
Exactly.
the painting of the kid in the
Exactly.
coffin.
Compassion.
She
Yes.
didn't
Insight.
have to
Yes.
be that kid's mother to, to feel what that pain is, right?
Was that Kim in the background reprimanding you?
She's mad as hell.
Yelling so loud they can hear you. They're like, "What's Steve yelling about?"
Who are you talking to?
Danny and Andrew.
Tell them go outside. Get out of here,
I
woman.
said you're yelling because Tom's in Forest. You want to make sure he hears you.
That's what happens when a couple of artists get together. They start to out yell each other. Next thing, good thing we're not opposite a table where we can punch each other out. That's what happened.
I hope this, I don't know if this is exactly what we wanted to do today, but I think it does address that kind of fine line between, you know, just making grotesque art that's mutilation and people are eating babies and dolls that are broken and children that have missing arms and limbs. You know, if you make art like that, but you're almost celebrating that Luciferian culture of death. And then there's other people that are making some art that may look similar to the naked eye. But what those people, in fact, are trying to do is bring awareness, or they're not even bringing awareness. They're painting from their heart because it really disturbs them to know that these atrocities are going on, or because maybe they experienced these atrocities, which is a lot of the art brut that you see, or the outsider art that victims of ritual abuse have created in therapy and stuff. And it's like that art's coming from a real place, or it's about something that's in
I think
reaction to that. They're not
you're talking
celebrating
about
it.
intent is everything in this regard. Intent,
I guess it is in a
intent.
weird way,
That if
yeah.
you're producing,
I would never make a painting of a child full of blood, missing limbs, and just leave it. I mean, if I was going to, address that issue, it wouldn't be. I mean, I don't think it would be
well,
quite like
I think
that.
you know what I would say to
Leave a
people in
painting.
regard to your work is that uh, the originality and the transition in your work has to do with the way you have made your work as much as what we see. You know, it's like you have images, but it's the way it's constructed and put together, especially your stitching, which I've always loved, the way you use your stitching and taking different diverse elements and pulling them together, tying together. The disturbing part of your work for me actually is that it feels like you're sewing skins together of you know, I don't want to go deeply into this. It's in my imagination, but they literally feel like very young skins being redeemed out of that purgatory of abuse. You know, it's like pulling it back. It's almost like, if you want to imagine, it's the opposite. What is that voodoo stuff? It's the opposite of voodoo. You know, where they stick a pin into somebody? You're you're doing the
Oh yeah,
reverse. You're actually salvaging something out of the you know, it's sort of like a feeling of redeeming, of trying to redeem something in a world that's gone totally crazy, not batshit fucking crazy, on something that is so obvious. This obvious abuse of the weak. And you know, you do it micro macro. The US, you know, the bully on the block can just go into Kuwait or Iraq or Syria and just kick the
that's right.
shit out of everybody.
Yeah, but here's the thing: what my paintings do, and it is related to that absolutely, about reparation, and it does kind of in a, certainly in a subconscious level, because I don't want to overanalyze it, but it does represent skin, but it represents reparation. And it's like, so some of these things that have happened lately in Syria or Iraq, and you've got soldiers or mercenaries, more likely mercenaries, because mercenaries are more prevalent in these wars now than any military force. So you got paid mercenaries coming in, and they can rampage and steal whatever they want, but they take the time, the careful time, to rape the mother in front of the 3 and 6 and 8-year-old kid, and the father, and then they have to screw her in the ass multiple times, and then of course they murder her, and they leave the kids alive, and the father, I guess, is probably murdered. But imagine you're one of those kids. So my paintings hopefully represent in some weird way, because some of these people survive. It's like, I've spoken to ritual abuse victims. It's mostly women, funny enough, and a lot of these women, I think more than the men, even. The women have a way, I'm not saying 100%, nowhere close, but there's a lot of women that have been buried alive in coffins, used in child porn, raped repeatedly at 2 and 3 years old in their rectum. Terrible, despicable, awful things. And these women have recovered,
That's extraordinary.
and they've put together lives for themselves, and they try to be
Wow.
forgiving. And it's like, you know what? Like, that's, to me, that's like, want to talk about reparation. That is real reparation, because whatever was done to them in the generational abuse, Luciferian family they grew up in, and why multiple men would rape this child, during a ceremony or whatever it was. The child's often forced to kill a baby, maybe their best friend, or a child, or one of their sisters or brothers. So to be one of these kids that survived this kind of stuff, man, that's
That's like
really a testament.
superhuman ability, almost. I mean, I can't hardly imagine how one could even recover. But in the context, you know, rather than, you know, I mean, when you when you talk like that, Stephen, it's almost like I shut down, right? Like as soon as I
Yeah,
hear,
I know.
you know, so what I try actually to do is to convert that sense, that awareness, to the extent that I have. I've not been in the trenches that way. I cannot say firsthand of this kind of suffering. I mean, I have had my little share of, a little bit of suffering, whatever. But what I think,
That's what war is too. When we look at
But
war, when
what
we look,
protects them also is the dissociation. The
oh, that's
mind
true.
protects them so that
Well,
they
that's why
can't
they
come
children
out.
have alters when they're little because
Because
they disassociate because they
and that's
can't
what
deal with it.
allows them
So
to
that's why you can have a child with 200 different alter personalities inside. But when you're talking about war and things like Iraq, and I mean, we've had more wars the last 100
that's
years
right.
than ever
And
before in
especially under
history.
Obama, he really expanded the war machine.
But he wins
I
the
mean,
Nobel
like,
Peace
what
Prize.
happens? What happens in war? Like, it's like a free for all for any of these mercenary or
Imagine
so.
if Obama
Yeah,
hadn't been awarded the Peace Prize, how bad it might have been. A good thing he got the Peace Prize. But what I'm thinking also is like from an art point of view, that we're talking about. You and I can have this discussion, which motivates us to actually go to the studio. Me, it does anyway, because what's the purpose of my life if I'm not going to address the most crucial and important issues we're facing while we're alive, right? It's not about how many cars Jay Leno has in his garage or motorcycles that Forbes has. We're trying to steer this ship into a direction with our work that addresses not just by talking about it, but by what I feel you're doing is there is a kind of what did I call it? A redemptive quality and being able to identify with a painting. If I look at a fabulous painting, there is a sort of an almost symbiotic relationship that's created. There is like the person that did it, but I'm somehow in that work as well. I can release something of myself in that work, right? So I'm seeing it, and I don't want to be like touchy feely therapeutic. I think a painting can kick your fucking ass, truly. I mean, I'm not on that therapeutic side of things, but it's
yeah.
happening. And if we don't make the work that actually allows, and I mentioned this to you, and I think you responded to the idea that the only thing we have left is not to tell people how bad it is, but to seduce them into our way of thinking through our work. That's how I truly feel the power, if there is any power in art, that's where it is. And my comment to you was that the more powerful it is, the likely it is to be original as well. That's what I think.
Oh, that's a good
That
point. Yeah.
powerful art isn't just something that's clever and well thought out and crafted. There is a quality, a mysterious quality that eventually will be recognized as being quite original. The way we come to things after 50 years or 100 years or 20 years, right?
Hey, you know what's funny? You know what I always think of things like that when you're talking about stuff like that? I can't help but think of that Dutch painter that did Scream.
Monk,
Oh, Munch.
Monk,
What?
Edward Munch.
Monk.
Munch? Yeah.
Munch.
But I mean, you can look at that thing and go,
I love that.
and anyone else can look it up online. But you could look at it and just say, well, that's that's no big deal, right? But the guy must have been having such a horror show when he painted it.
He was sick. He was a very
It
sick
just
guy,
feels
right?
like
He had like an anemic situation. All his life, he was like always on the verge of dying.